Hello world, this is Paul Flatley. Today I'm going to start reading The Freedom Walkers. This book is the story of the Montgomery bus boycott by Russell Freedman. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus and give up her seat to a white man. Her quiet refusal to surrender her dignity sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, which eventually ended segregation on the buses. But the boycott did not start or end there. And here, Nobel medalist Russell Freedman breathes life into all the key personalities and events that contributed to the year-long struggle, a major victory in the civil rights movement. This compelling and poignant volume, illustrated with powerful black and white photographs from the period, is sure to be an essential addition to the civil rights canon. So just remember that our African Americans who are peacefully protesting right now and white people and Hispanic people and Asian people are supporting our African American friends who have been discriminated against. People think that it's been a short while, but they were enslaved over 494 years ago and brought here from Africa, and were enslaved here for hundreds of years until Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, made it legal for them to be free. So I'm going to read The Freedom Walkers. Today I'm going to read the introduction and the beginning part of the book. So The Freedom Walkers, the Montgomery bus boycott, Russell Freedman. And here's the people walking to work from the bus boycott. Front piece, walking to work during the 381-day Montgomery bus boycott. Many boycotters walked hundreds of miles over the course of the year rather than ride the buses. For Kate, the warm and moving spirit of Holiday House. Here's the map of the Montgomery bus boycott, and you can see the different areas that people had to walk to work, where it started, where people went to jail, the churches, and things like that. The introduction, why they walked. Not so long ago in Montgomery, Alabama, the color of your skin determined where you could sit on a public bus. If you happen to be an African American, you had to sit in the back of the bus, even if there were empty seats up front. Back then, racial segregation was the rule throughout America. South. Strict laws called Jim Crow laws enforced a system of white supremacy that discriminated against blacks and kept them in their place as second-class citizens. People were separated by race from the moment they were born in segregated hospitals until the day they were buried in segregated cemeteries. Blacks and whites did not attend the same schools, worship in the same churches, eat in the same restaurants, sleep in the same hotels, drink from the same water fountains, or sit together in the same movie theaters. In Montgomery, it was against the law for a white person and a Negro to play checkers on public property or ride together in a taxi cab. Most Southern blacks were denied their right to vote. The biggest obstacle was the poll tax, a special tax that was required of all voters, but was too costly for many blacks and for poor whites as well. Voters also had to pass a literacy test to prove that they could read, write, and understand the U.S. Constitution. These tests were often rigged to disqualify even highly educated blacks. Those who overcame the obstacles and insisted on registering as voters faced threats, harassment, and even physical violence. As a result, African Americans in the South could not express their grievances in the voting booth, which, for the most part, was closed to them. But there were other ways to protest, and one day, half a century ago, it's longer now, it's 65 years now, the black citizens in Montgomery rose up in protest and united to demand their rights by walking peacefully. It started on a bus. Here's a picture of the segregated bus. The black people are in the back and the whites are up in front. Chapter 1, Joanne Robinson. Get up from there! Get up from there! Looking back, she remembered as it was the most humiliating experience of her life. A deep hurt that would not heal. It happened just before Christmas in 1949. She was about to visit relatives in Cleveland, Ohio, where she would spend the holidays. Earlier that day, she had driven out to Danley Field, the Montgomery, Alabama airport, and checked her luggage for the flight to Cleveland. Then she drove back to the campus of Alabama State, an all-black college where she had been hired that fall as a professor of English. After parking her car in the campus garage, she took her armful of Christmas gifts, walked to the nearest bus stop, and waited for a ride back to the airport. Soon, a Montgomery City Line bus rolled into view and pulled up at the stop. Balancing her packages, Joanne Robinson stepped aboard and dropped her dime in the fare box. She saw that the bus was nearly empty. Only 2 other passengers were aboard, a black man in a seat near the back and a white woman in the 3rd seat from the front. Without thinking, Robinson took a seat 2 rows behind the white woman. I took the 5th row seat from the front and sat down, she recalled, immediately closing my eyes and envisioning in my mind's eye the wonderful 2-week vacation I would have with my family and friends. So this is her back then, Joanne Robinson. And the little note that she writes there is, I think he would have wanted to hurt me, and he did. Jolted out of her reverie by an angry voice, she opened her eyes and sat upright. The bus driver had come to a full stop and turned in his seat. He was speaking to her. If you can sit in the 5th row from the front seat of other buses in Montgomery, he said, suppose you get off and ride one of them. The driver's message didn't register at first. Robinson was still thinking about her holiday trip. Suddenly, the driver rose from his seat, went over to her, and stood with his arm drawn back as if to strike her. Get up from there, he yelled. Get up from there. Shaken in alarm, Robinson bolted to her feet and stumbled off the bus in tears, packages falling from her arms. She had made the mistake in sitting in one of the front 10 seats, which were reserved for the white-only riders. So this picture here shows colored-only riders where they had to go, and this picture here shows where the white riders used to have to go when they could ride buses separately. I felt like a dog, she wrote later, and I got mad. After this was over, I realized I was a human being, and just as intelligent, and just as intelligent and more educationally trained than that bus driver was. But I think he wanted to hurt me, and he did. I cried all the way to Cleveland. Robinson was still mad when she returned to Montgomery after the Christmas holiday. She had recently joined the local Women's Political Council, WPC, an influential organization of African American teachers, nurses, social workers, and other professional women who work to advance Black community interest. But when she told her fellow members what had happened, she learned that her experience was far from unusual. Scores of Black passengers, mainly women, had suffered abuse from white bus drivers over the years. Such behavior was a fact of life in Montgomery, she was told. Members of the Women's Council had protested before, but it hadn't helped. Robinson made up her mind then that she would do everything in her power to challenge the city's segregated bus seating. Every day, as many as 40,000 blacks rode Montgomery's public buses, along with some 12,000 whites. The first 10 seats of every bus were reserved for white riders, with the last 20 available to blacks. But the dividing line between the white and black sections wasn't fixed. The driver had the power to expand the white section and shrink the black section by ordering blacks to give up their seats to whites. As white passengers boarded the bus and dropped their dimes into the fare box, they took seats in the front. Black passengers were not allowed to walk past the white section after paying their fare. Instead, they had to get off the bus and re-enter through the back door. Sometimes a spiteful driver would accept the black rider's fare and then, while the passenger was walking around to enter the back door, would drive off. Not all drivers were guilty of such practices, Robinson wrote. There were some very fine, courteous bus drivers who were kindly disposed and carried out the laws of segregation without offending the riders. There were good and mean drivers, considerate and hateful ones, and black riders had to cope with both types. The bus system was a bitter daily reminder of enforced segregation in Montgomery. Many black riders were women who rode across town every morning to work as maids, cooks, and nurses in white homes. Other black passengers were students, young children, and old folks. All of them were powerless to challenge white drivers when they were ordered to give up their seats, because the drivers had the force of law behind them. Even when not a single white passenger was on board, the front 10 seats in every bus was reserved for whites, just in case one or two did ride. Often black riders jammed the aisles of the bus, standing over those empty seats where they dared not sit down. And if the white section happened to fill up, then the blacks sitting just behind the reserved seats had to get up as more whites got on. Elderly black men and women were required by law to get out of their seats so that the white school children could take their seat. Joanne Robinson did not take kindly to being pushed around. She had grown up on a small Georgia farm, the youngest of 12 children, and graduated from a segregated all-black high school as the class valedictorian, and was the first member of her family to complete college. After teaching in Texas, she moved to Montgomery in the summer of 1949, at the age of 37, to join the English department at Alabama State, where she earned her reputation as an enthusiastic and popular teacher. Robinson joined the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, attended by many Alabama State professors. That's when she became a member of the Women's Political Council, which had been founded 3 years earlier when the local League of Women Voters refused to accept blacks. We were women power, organized to cope with any injustice, no matter what, she recalled. I had suffered the most humiliating experience of my life when the bus driver had ordered me off the 5th row seat from the front and threatened to strike me when I did not move fast enough. Thus, I was ready to take over WPC when the time came. In 1950, she was elected president of the WPC. Under her leadership, segregated seating on public buses became the group's most pressing issue. Joined by other black community leaders, Robinson and the women of WPC met several times with Montgomery city commissioners and later with bus company officials. Their demands were modest. They simply asked for better seating arrangements. The word integration was never mentioned. To admit that black Americans were seeking to integrate would have been too much, Robinson said later. There probably would have been much bloodshed and arrests for those who dared to suggest such an idea. The black leaders complained about abusive drivers. They pointed out the bus stops were farther apart in black neighborhoods than whites, and they asked that the bus company hire some black drivers. The two white officials listened politely. They reminded the blacks that segregation on public buses was required by both city and state laws. But they did make a couple of small concessions. The mayor instructed the bus company to begin stopping at every corner in black neighborhoods, just as buses did in the white sections of town. And he requested the drivers be more courteous in the future. Nothing else changed. Then, on May 17, 1954, the Montgomery Advertiser carried a sensational front-page headline. In a monumentous decision that would affect race relations across America, the United States Supreme Court had declared that segregation in the nation's public schools was unconstitutional. While the ruling had no immediate effect in Montgomery, many African Americans believed the same principle applied to other segregated facilities, such as public transportation. So here's a picture of an African American man who was going to college with the whites, but he was sent off to another room off to the side and not able to sit with the white kids. Here at last was a real chance to challenge the segregation laws. Joanne Robinson was inspired to write to Montgomery Mayor W.A. Tacky Gale, demanding improved conditions for black riders on city buses and mentioning for the first time the possibility of a boycott. Mayor Gale, 3/4 of the riders on these public conveniences are Negroes, she wrote. If Negroes did not patronize them, they would not possibly operate. There has been talk from 25 or more local organizations of planning a citywide boycott of buses. To be effective, a boycott would need the united support of the city's African American bus riders. Most of them could not afford to own automobiles, and how would they get to work? Asking blacks to protest for the rights in the segregated South of the early 50s was asking them to summon uncommon personal courage to put their livelihoods and even their physical safety on the line. They could be fired from their jobs, harassed on the streets, or worse. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacy groups did everything they could to intimidate blacks into submission, and they did not shrink from violence. Blacks who broke the Jim Crow color bar might be terrorized, beaten, or even murdered. I don't have the slightest idea how, without involving others who might get hurt, to begin a boycott against the bus company, Robinson recalled. But as stories continued to spread about the abuse of drivers and humiliating incidents on city buses, anger in the black community grew. The Women's Political Council began to discuss plans for the boycott that would harness that anger and mobilize the strengths of Montgomery's black community. Here is a masked Ku Klux Klan member hanging out a noose from his car as they were driving through the black community. And that picture was in Florida. That's the end of chapter 1.